Think about the last time you held a gold coin, or even just saw one in a movie. That glint, that weight, the way it seems to whisper power. We've been conditioned to believe that gold was the ultimate prize throughout history, the crown jewel of wealth. But what if I told you that in the medieval world, gold wasn't even close to the most valuable currency? In fact, the real treasures of the Middle Ages were far more ordinary, and yet infinitely more vital. Picture a bustling medieval marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of spices, the shouts of merchants, the clatter of goods. But if you listen closely, you won't hear the jingle of gold coins. Instead, you'll hear the rustle of grain sacks, the haggling over bolts of cloth, the bartering for something as simple as salt. Because in a world where survival was precarious, wealth wasn't about glitter, it was about necessity. This is the untold story of medieval economics, where the true currencies weren't just metals, but the very things that kept people alive and societies functioning. Spices preserved food and masked the taste of spoilage. Salt was so precious it funded empires and sparked wars. Land wasn't just dirt, it was the source of food, power, and loyalty. And labor, that was the engine that turned the wheels of kingdoms. These were the real measures of wealth, the invisible threads that wove together the fabric of medieval life. And here's the twist: these ancient systems of value didn't just vanish. They evolved, leaving fingerprints on our modern economy in ways you might not expect. So why does this matter today? Because understanding what people truly valued in the past reveals something profound about how we assign worth not just to objects, but to each other. The medieval world reminds us that value isn't static. It's shaped by need, by scarcity, by the raw struggle to thrive. And as we peel back the layers of history, you'll start to see echoes of these old currencies in everything from your grocery bill to the global trade routes that shape our lives. This isn't just a tale of the past, it's a mirror held up to our own world, asking us to rethink what we consider precious, ready to uncover the secrets of medieval wealth. Let's begin. The idea that gold ruled the medieval world is one of history's most persistent myths. Yes, kings hoarded it in vaults, and yes, it adorned the crowns of emperors, but for the vast majority of people, gold might as well have been a fairy tale. Think about it. If you were a farmer in the year 1200, when would you ever even see a gold coin? The local miller didn't accept gold for grinding your grain. The blacksmith didn't demand it to shoe your horse. Even the tax collector often preferred payment in crops, livestock, or labor. Gold was the currency of palaces, not peasants. Here's the reality: medieval economies ran on usefulness, not dazzle. A sack of barley could feed your family for months. A bolt of woolen cloth could be traded for tools or turned into clothing to survive the winter. These weren't just goods, they were life itself. And that's why the true power players of the medieval marketplace weren't the goldsmiths, but the salt merchants, the spice traders, the landowners who controlled the fields that put bread on tables. Consider salt, a humble mineral we barely think about today. In the Middle Ages, it was so indispensable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, giving us the word salary. Without it, meat couldn't be preserved, diets were dangerously bland, and entire regions faced scarcity. Cities rose and fell based on access to salt routes. In some places, salt blocks were carved into literal coins, used as currency alongside grain and cloth. That's how vital it was. Gold, by contrast, was ornamental. It couldn't fill a hungry belly or heal a wound. It couldn't build alliances the way a gift of rare spices could. When Venetian traders brought pepper from the east, they weren't just selling flavor. They were selling status, health, even the ability to mask spoiled food in an era before refrigeration. A pinch of saffron could be worth more than its weight in gold because it did something. This disconnect between our modern obsession with gold and the medieval obsession with utility reveals a deeper truth. Value is never absolute. It's shaped by what a society needs to survive. Today, we live in a world of abstract wealth, digital numbers in bank accounts, stocks, cryptocurrencies. But strip away the layers and you'll find the same principle at work. Our most essential currencies are still the ones that keep the world running: energy, food, clean water. The medieval world just had the honesty to call them what they were. Salt was the invisible backbone of medieval civilization, a mineral so crucial that it shaped empires and dictated the rise of cities. Imagine a world without refrigeration, where meat would spoil within days unless preserved. Salt was the difference between feast and famine, between a winter of plenty and one of starvation. This wasn't just a commodity, it was survival itself. And that's why control over salt mines and trade routes meant control over life and death. Take Salzburg, the Salt Castle, a city built on the wealth of its white gold. Its name alone tells the story. The salt extracted from its mines didn't just season food. It fueled an entire economy, funding cathedrals, armies, and even the arts. But Salzburg was just one node in a vast network. Across Europe, from the salt pans of Brittany to the mines of Poland, entire regions thrived because of this unassuming crystal. The trade routes that carried salt became the arteries of medieval commerce, linking distant lands in a web of necessity and profit. The Latin word sal gives us more than just salary. It's a linguistic fossil of how deeply salt was woven into the fabric of daily life. Roman soldiers received salt rations as part of their pay, a practice so ingrained that even today we speak of being worth our salt. But this wasn't just a Roman quirk. In Africa, slabs of salt were used as currency in the trans-Saharan trade. In China, salt taxes bankrolled dynasties. From the Himalayas to the Mediterranean, salt was universal currency because its value was undeniable. What made salt so powerful wasn't just its utility but its scarcity. Not every region had salt deposits, and extracting it was backbreaking labor. In some places, seawater was evaporated in shallow pans, a slow process dependent on the sun. In others, miners carved it from the earth, risking cave-ins and floods. The difficulty of production meant that those who controlled salt wielded outsized influence. Kings taxed it, merchants hoarded it, and wars were fought over it. And here's the fascinating twist: salt's legacy didn't end with the Middle Ages. The same economic forces that made it medieval currency still shape our world today. Think about oil, lithium, even data. Modern societies still pivot around control of essential resources. The players have changed, but the game remains the same. Salt reminds us that true value isn't about shine or symbolism. It's about what keeps the world running, one humble crystal at a time. Pepper was so valuable in medieval Europe that a single sack could buy a small estate. Cinnamon was guarded like state secrets. Cloves were worth more than rubies. These weren't just seasonings. They were power, prestige, and survival packed into tiny, aromatic bundles. While gold sat idle in vaults, spices coursed through the veins of global trade, shaping economies and rewriting history. Their value wasn't just in flavor, but in their ability to transform the medieval world's most basic struggles. Take pepper, the king of spices. In an era before refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, and the pungent bite of pepper didn't just make it palatable, it masked the taste of rot, turning dangerous meals into edible ones. A sprinkle of cinnamon could make stale bread taste luxurious. Nutmeg was believed to ward off the plague. In a time when food preservation was a matter of life and death, spices weren't culinary luxuries, they were medicinal necessities. That's why apothecaries and spice merchants often occupied the same stalls in medieval markets. But spices did something else too. They became the ultimate status symbol. Serving a dish heavy with saffron or ginger wasn't just about taste, it was a flashing sign of wealth. The richer the spice, the higher the host's standing. In some courts, nobles would display their spice cabinets like modern collectors flaunt rare art, locking them away as prized possessions. When the Duke of Burgundy wanted to impress guests, he didn't just serve gold-plated dishes, he burned cinnamon sticks as firewood, filling the hall with a scent so expensive it screamed power. This obsession didn't just fill banquet halls, it redrew the map of the world. The spice trade forged routes from the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of Indonesia, all the way to Venice, where merchants grew fat on profits. Arab traders controlled the overland routes, spinning tales of spice origins to justify sky-high prices, like claiming cinnamon was harvested from nests built by mythical birds. When Europeans grew desperate to cut out the middlemen, they launched ships into the unknown. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, driven by pepper, Columbus stumbling upon the Americas. A wrong turn in search of a faster spice route. The craze had dark consequences. Wars erupted over control of spice-producing regions. The Dutch massacred entire villages to monopolize nutmeg. Empires rose and fell on the back of this trade, and the ripple effects shaped our modern world. The British East India Company, originally a spice trader, became an imperial juggernaut. Global capitalism, stock markets, even colonization all tied to the humble spice trade. Yet here's the irony. Today, we casually toss these once priceless flavors into shopping carts without a second thought. What changed? Not the spices themselves, but our ability to access them. The medieval world reminds us that value isn't inherent. It's created by need, by scarcity, by the stories we attach to things. In an age of instant global trade, we've lost the awe that once surrounded a single peppercorn. But the next time you reach for that spice jar, pause. You're holding not just flavor, but the ghost of a currency that once moved mountains, toppled kings, and connected continents. Grain was the silent ruler of the medieval world, not locked in treasure chests but piled high in granaries, measured out in pecks and bushels, traded in bustling markets from London to Constantinople. While gold glittered in royal coffers, grain kept kingdoms alive. A single bad harvest could topple empires, spark rebellions, or send entire regions into starvation. This wasn't just a crop, it was the foundation of civilization itself, the original currency that fed both peasants and kings. Picture a medieval village after the autumn harvest. The air smells of freshly cut wheat, and the granary doors groan under the weight of the year's bounty. That grain isn't just food, it's rent for the lord's lands, wages for the miller, barter for the blacksmith services. It's seed for next year's planting and insurance against the lean months ahead. In a world where 90% of people worked the land, grain wasn't just wealth, it was the very measure of time. The farming calendar dictated everything from religious festivals to warfare, because armies marched only after the harvest was in. The power dynamics were stark. Landowners who controlled grain controlled life itself. Monasteries, often the largest landowners, became economic hubs because their storehouses could feed entire regions during famines. Cities like Paris and Florence built massive public granaries, knowing that bread riots could overthrow governments faster than any invading army. When the English crown needed to fund wars, they didn't just demand gold. They requisitioned grain shipments to feed their troops. A sack of wheat could buy loyalty, pay mercenaries, or crush a rebellion by withholding it. But here's what made grain extraordinary as currency: its universality. Unlike gold, which was useless to a starving family, grain had intrinsic value everywhere. A peasant in France might never see a silver penny, but they understood exactly what a bushel of barley was worth. It crossed language barriers, religious divides, even enemy lines. During sieges, attackers would burn fields to starve out cities, while defenders hoarded every last kernel like precious coins. Grain was so vital that counterfeiting it became a capital offense. Adulterating flour with chalk or sawdust could get you hanged. The legacy of this grain economy still echoes today. Modern commodity markets, where wheat and corn prices fluctuate like stocks, descend directly from medieval grain exchanges. The word salary might come from salt, but dough as slang for money. That's pure grain heritage. Even our fear of inflation has roots in this era when harvests failed, grain prices skyrocketed, and societies unraveled. So next time you pass a bakery, think about the humble loaf on the shelf. 700 years ago, that bread wasn't just a meal, it was power, stability, survival. Gold built thrones, but grain built the world. Land wasn't just property in the Middle Ages, it was the operating system of entire societies. While gold collected dust in vaults, land produced everything that mattered: food to fill bellies, timber to build homes, pastures to graze livestock, and rivers to turn mill wheels. Owning land meant controlling the very lifeblood of communities, which is why feudal lords measured their wealth not in coins, but in acres. A king might dazzle with golden crowns, but his real power came from the fields that fed his armies and the forests that supplied his ships. Consider how feudal contracts worked. When a knight pledged loyalty to his lord, he wasn't given a chest of treasure. He received a parcel of land, complete with peasants to farm it. This wasn't generosity, it was a calculated exchange. The land generated income through crops, rents, and labor, making the knight both wealthy and obligated to defend his benefactor. Entire hierarchies were built this way, from kings granting duchies to barons doling out manors. Even the word lord comes from the Old English H. Lofford, meaning loaf warden, the keeper of bread. Land equaled sustenance, and sustenance equaled control. The value of land went beyond economics. It was a social and military currency. A noble's status depended on how much territory he commanded, not how shiny his jewels were. Wars were fought over borderlands, marriages arranged to consolidate estates, and treaties sealed with the transfer of fields and forests. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he didn't just claim the throne. He redistributed nearly every inch of arable land to his followers, reshaping the kingdom's power structure overnight. The Domesday Book, his famous survey, wasn't a tally of gold but a meticulous record of who owned which plots, because land was the true ledger of power. Peasants understood this reality intimately. For them, land wasn't an asset, it was survival. A serf bound to a manor didn't dream of gold coins. He prayed for good soil, timely rains, and a fair share of the harvest. The difference between a thriving village and a ghost town often came down to a few fertile acres. That's why land disputes could spark blood feuds lasting generations, and why commoners sometimes risked everything to clear new fields from wilderness. In a world without banks or stock markets, land was the only investment that never truly lost value. The echoes of this system surround us today. Modern real estate empires function on the same principle. Control the land, and you control the resources and opportunities that flow from it. The sprawling estates of medieval barons have their counterparts in corporate farmland acquisitions and urban development giants. Even our language betrays this legacy. We still speak of landed gentry and property empires, unconsciously acknowledging that dirt holds enduring power. Gold may glitter, but dirt endures, and in the medieval world, endurance was the ultimate currency. In the shadow of castles and cathedrals, the real engine of the medieval economy wasn't gold or grain, it was sweat. The labor of peasants turned soil into sustenance, raw wool into wealth, and stone into fortresses. While lords flaunted their silks and spices, their true power came from something far more tangible: control over human hands. This was an economy built not on coins, but on the unrelenting work of countless unnamed people whose toil literally moved mountains. Consider the humble serf, bound to the land from birth to death. His rent wasn't paid in currency, but in days, 3 days each week working the Lord's fields, another day repairing roads, endless hours grinding grain at the manorial mill. These obligations weren't arbitrary. They were meticulously calculated to extract maximum value while leaving just enough for survival. A lord's wealth wasn't counted in treasure chests, but in the number of laborers at his disposal. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's Great Survey, didn't just record land. It tallied plows, oxen, and most crucially, the peasants who wielded them. But labor wasn't just about brute force. Skilled workers held a different kind of power. A blacksmith could transform lumps of ore into plowshares or swords, making his craft indispensable. Weavers turned raw fleece into tradable cloth, their looms humming with economic potential. These artisans rarely saw gold coins. Instead, they traded services directly. A cobbler might mend shoes for a baker in exchange for bread, creating a web of reciprocal obligations that kept villages functioning. The system had a dark genius to it. By tying survival to labor, feudal lords ensured a perpetual workforce. A peasant couldn't simply save up coins to buy freedom. Without land or alternative income, his only asset was his own body. Yet this wasn't pure exploitation. Labor created mutual dependence. Lords needed harvests brought in, castles maintained, and armies fed. When famine struck or wars erupted, it was the laborers' resilience that determined whether societies collapsed or endured. We still live with the echoes of this system today. Modern salaries descend from medieval labor obligations, and the gig economy mirrors the piecework of cottage industries. The difference: in the Middle Ages, people understood the direct link between effort and survival. There was no abstraction, no stocks, no cryptocurrencies, just the visceral reality that if you stopped working, you stopped eating. That's why labor wasn't just a currency in medieval times. It was the heartbeat of civilization itself. Silver was the quiet hero of medieval markets, the unsung metal that kept daily life moving. While gold glittered in royal treasuries and spices commanded exotic prestige, silver pennies jingled in the pockets of merchants, farmers, and craftsmen. These small, durable coins were the grease that turned the wheels of ordinary commerce, buying bread, paying rents, settling tavern tabs. Unlike gold, which was hoarded or reserved for grand transactions, silver was democratic. It didn't just symbolize wealth, it facilitated the countless small exchanges that made society function. The silver penny's dominance wasn't an accident. Its value was carefully calibrated to match the rhythms of medieval life. A single penny could buy a loaf of bread or a day's labor from a craftsman. 20 pennies might purchase a chicken, 200 a modest sword. This granularity made it infinitely more useful than gold, which was often too valuable for everyday purchases. Imagine trying to buy a cup of ale with a gold coin. The tavern keeper wouldn't have changed. Silver solved this problem, bridging the gap between bartering eggs for wool and financing a lord's ransom. Mints across Europe churned out these coins by the millions, each bearing the face of a king or local ruler. That stamp wasn't just decoration, it was a promise. Unlike irregular chunks of silver bullion, minted pennies had standardized weights and purity. so traders from London to Constantinople could trust their value without scales or assays. This reliability turned silver into the first true currency in the modern sense, a universal medium of exchange that transcended local barter systems. But silver's real power lay in its flexibility. It could be sliced into halves or quarters for smaller purchases, melted down for larger transactions, or even woven into elaborate jewelry for display. In times of crisis, silver tableware might be hastily hammered into coins to pay soldiers. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, survivors used hoarded silver to buy abandoned land, reshaping the social order. This adaptability made it the backbone of economic mobility, allowing resourceful individuals to climb the ladder in ways gold never permitted. The legacy of medieval silver echoes in our pockets today. The British pound sterling originally referred to a pound weight of silver pennies, and the Spanish dollar, a direct descendant of medieval coins, became the model for modern currencies like the US dollar. Even the word money itself comes from the Roman mint at Juno Monitor, where silver coins were first struck. So next time you toss a handful of change onto a counter, remember, you're participating in a tradition that once rebuilt civilizations, one humble silver penny at a time. In a world without banks or stock portfolios, medieval elites carried their wealth on their backs literally. The rustle of silk, the weight of woolen brocade, the intricate patterns of embroidered cloth weren't just fashion statements. They were walking ledgers of status and savings. Unlike gold bars locked in chests, fine fabrics could be draped over shoulders, hung on walls, or rolled into bales for trade across continents. A merchant's fortune might be woven into the very threads of his cloak, and a noblewoman's dowry could consist of bolts of linen so fine they rivaled the value of jewels. Take Flanders, where humble sheep's wool transformed into a medieval economic superpower. Flemish weavers didn't just produce cloth, they minted currency with their looms. Their tightly woven woolens, water-resistant and durable, became the medieval equivalent of designer labels coveted from Paris to Constantinople. A single shipment of Flemish broadcloth could buy a ship, pay a mercenary army, or secure a royal alliance. The wealth generated by these textiles built soaring Gothic guild halls that still dominate city squares in Bruges and Ghent, monuments to an industry that bankrolled duchies. But cloth's real genius lay in its flexibility as currency. A tapestry wasn't just a decoration for drafty castle walls. It could be pawned to fund a war or given as diplomatic tribute. When King Edward III of England needed to finance his campaigns against France, he didn't just empty his treasury. He leveraged his kingdom's wool exports, creating a system where sacks of raw fleece stood in for gold reserves. Even peasants participated in this economy, spinning homespun wool into smaller denominations of exchange, a mitten's worth here, a tunic's value there. Silk, imported at staggering cost from the East, played an even more fascinating role. Lightweight yet extravagantly expensive, it became the ultimate convertible asset. A Byzantine diplomat might bribe a barbarian chieftain with silk robes instead of coins, knowing the fabric carried instant prestige. In Viking graves as far north as Norway, archaeologists find fragments of silk, evidence that these raiders prized the fabric not for its beauty, but as a compact form of plunder that held value across cultures. The legacy of this textile economy lingers in unexpected places. Modern financial terms like clothing allowance or spinster, originally a woman who earned her living spinning wool, trace back to this era. The stock exchanges of Antwerp and Florence, often credited as birthplaces of modern finance, grew from cloth trading halls. Even today, when we say someone is well-heeled, we're unconsciously referencing the medieval notion that what you wore reflected what you were worth. Gold could be stolen, land seized, but a skillfully woven textile, That was wealth you could wrap around yourself and walk away with the original liquid asset. A cow was more than livestock in the Middle Ages. It was a four-legged bank account, a wool-covered pension plan, and a self-replenishing food source all in one. While gold gathered dust in some lords' strongbox, herds of cattle, sheep, and goats moved across the landscape like living currency, their value measured not in weight but in milk, muscle, and offspring. In rural communities from Ireland to the steppes of Russia, wealth wasn't counted in coins but in the size of your flock. The Icelandic sagas didn't describe a man's riches by his gold rings, but by how many cows grazed in his pastures, because livestock didn't just represent wealth, they created it daily. Take something as simple as a dairy cow. She wasn't just a walking milk factory, she was an economic engine. Her milk could be drunk fresh, churned into butter that wouldn't spoil, or fermented into cheese for lean winters. Her calves expanded the herd or could be traded at market. Even her dung had value piled high as fuel in regions where wood was scarce. A single healthy cow could sustain a family, while a dozen might lift them to prosperity. No wonder cattle raids feature so prominently in medieval legends. Stealing cows wasn't petty theft. It was like robbing a vault. Sheep were no different. Their wool clipped annually was a renewable resource, spun into yarn that functioned as a tradable commodity across Europe. In England, the wool trade grew so lucrative that sacks of fleece became collateral for royal loans. Sheepskin could be parchment for scribes, their meat salted for winter, their very existence turning grassy hillsides into sources of continuous income. Unlike a gold coin spent and gone, a flock only grew more valuable with time. Then there were horses, the medieval equivalent of luxury cars mixed with tractors. A sturdy plough horse could triple a farmer's harvest, while a knight's war horse was worth years of a commoner's wages. Breeding them was a high-stakes industry. The finest Arabian stallions imported to Europe fetched prices that could bankrupt nobles. But even an ordinary mare was a wealth generator, giving birth to foals that could be sold, traded, or put to work. The brilliance of livestock as currency lay in its resilience. When Vikings raided, they couldn't steal land, but they could drive off cattle. When inflation made coins worthless, a sheep still produced wool. When famine struck, a goat could provide milk long after grain stores ran out. These weren't just animals, they were the original hedge funds, combining utility, reproduction, and portability in a way gold never could. Centuries later, we still see echoes of this system. The word pecuniary, meaning related to money, comes from the Latin pecus or cattle. Stock markets got their name from literal livestock markets where wealth was traded. And in times of crisis, people still instinctively turn to tangible assets, proof that deep down we remember what real value looks like. It isn't shiny. It breathes. Pepper sacks in a medieval warehouse weren't just inventory, they were a merchant's credit score. Picture this: a Venetian trader strides into a banking house in 12th century Genoa, not with a chest of coins, but with a burlap sack bursting with aromatic peppercorns. To modern eyes, it might look like barter, but this was high finance. Those peppercorns functioned as collateral, securing loans to fund ships, purchase silks, or even settle international debts. Why? Because pepper's value was as reliable as minted silver and far more portable than land. In a world without standardized currencies or credit ratings, spice became the original global reserve currency. London's customs records from 1190 reveal something astonishing. Rents for prime market stalls were sometimes paid not in sterling, but in measures of pepper. Tax collectors accepted it alongside silver pennies, and monasteries stockpiled it alongside grain in their storehouses. This wasn't eccentricity, it was economic pragmatism. Unlike gold, which fluctuated in value based on royal whims or mining strikes, pepper's demand was ironclad. From the fish markets of Scandinavia to the royal kitchens of Delhi, everyone needed it. That universality made it the perfect medium for trust. A loan secured with pepper in Alexandria could be repaid in Lisbon because the spice held its worth across borders and faiths. The system worked so well that pepper even shaped early banking innovations. Italian merchant houses issued letters of credit backed by pepper stores, allowing traders to move wealth across continents without risking shipwrecks or bandits. In Calicut, Indian spice merchants used peppercorns as accounting units, tallying transactions in pepper weights rather than coinage. When King John of England needed emergency funds to rebuild his navy in 1214, he didn't pawn the crown jewels, he leveraged the royal pepper reserves. Here's what made pepper extraordinary as financial instrument. It couldn't be counterfeited. Gold coins could be clipped or debased, land titles forged, but a peppercorn was either pungent and valuable or stale and worthless. Quality was self-evident, a sniff test sufficed for due diligence. This inherent honesty streamlined trade, allowing markets from Bruges to Beijing to transact with minimal haggling. The echoes of this system linger today. Commodity-backed currencies, futures trading, even the concept of spice money in modern India's informal economies all descend from medieval pepper finance. Next time you grind pepper over a meal, consider this. 600 years ago, that humble sprinkle was once the grease that kept the wheels of empires turning. Not bad for a dried berry. The Hanseatic League didn't deal in glitter, they dealt in grit. While kings obsessed over gold crowns and silk robes, this sprawling network of merchants built an empire on the unglamorous essentials, towering stacks of Baltic timber, barrels of salted herring, mountains of beeswax candles. Their ledgers read like a grocery list, not a treasure inventory, and that was the secret to their staggering success. From the 1300s to the 1600s, the League dominated Northern Europe not by hoarding precious metals, but by mastering the art of moving what people actually needed. Take herring, the humble fish that bankrolled an economic revolution. Every summer, when vast shoals migrated through the Baltic, the League's fishermen swung into action. Their innovation wasn't just catching the fish, it was preserving them. By salting and barreling herring on an industrial scale, they created the medieval equivalent of canned goods, non-perishable protein that could feed armies, sustain cities through winter, and travel thousands of miles without spoiling. A single Hanseatic cog ship might carry 200 barrels, each containing 1,000 fish. That's 200,000 meals in one hull, a floating fortune that made spices look like pocket change. Then there was timber, the steel of the Middle Ages. Hanseatic merchants didn't just sell planks, they sold the bones of civilization. From the dense forests of Prussia and Livonia, they shipped oak for shipbuilding, pine for housing, and ash for tools. London's docks, Amsterdam's warehouses, even Venice's canals were built with wood hauled by the League. Their control was so complete that when England's navy needed massed timber during wars, they had to negotiate with Hanseatic traders like dealing with a modern oil cartel. But perhaps their most ingenious currency was beeswax, the medieval world's light bulbs. In an age before electricity, candles were non-negotiable for churches, workshops, and homes. The League's wax, harvested from Baltic apiaries, burned cleaner and longer than smoky tallow. Churches across Europe paid premiums for it, using Hanseatic wax to keep eternal flames lit before altars. A single shipment to Bruges or Novgorod could buy a merchant a townhouse. What made the Hanseatic model revolutionary wasn't just what they traded, but how. They pioneered systems we now take for granted. Standardized barrels for easy stacking, warehouse receipts that functioned as early checks, even maritime insurance pools to spread risk. Their contour trading posts, part fortress, part stock exchange, became prototypes for modern free ports. While Italian bankers speculated on exotic spices, the hands stuck to bulk commodities with predictable demand. The lesson of real wealth isn't about rarity, it's about reliability. The League collapsed only when new sea routes and nation-states disrupted their networks, but their legacy endures. Every container ship stacked with grain or oil tanker brimming with crude follows the Hanseatic playbook. Move what the world runs on, not just what it admires. Gold built thrones, but herring and timber built the world. The rustle of wheat sheaves being stacked in a monastery storeroom was the sound of medieval Europe's most powerful economy at work. When peasants bowed their heads to deliver their tithes, 1/10 of their harvest, their lambs, their very sweat, they weren't just fulfilling a religious duty. They were feeding a system that turned faith into tangible power. The church didn't want gold coins clinking in its coffers. It wanted grain to feed its armies of clergy, wool to clothe them, and hands to build its cathedrals. This wasn't just spirituality, it was a masterclass in resource accumulation that made the Vatican richer than any kingdom. Consider the math behind a single village tithe. If every family gave 1/10 of their barley crop, the local parish soon amassed enough to feed itself, sell the surplus, and loan the remainder to desperate farmers at interest. Multiply that across thousands of villages, and you'll understand how monasteries became the Walmart warehouses of the Middle Ages, stockpiling not just food, but honey, candles, cheese, and hides. The Abbey of Cluny in 12th century France didn't just accept tithes. It operated a vast redistribution network, moving goods from fertile regions to areas hit by famine, all while taking a cut. The line between charity and capitalism blurred until they were indistinguishable. But the real genius was in how the church monetized labor. Instead of demanding coins from a peasant who'd never seen one, priests asked for days repairing chapel roofs, digging irrigation ditches, grinding grain at the monastery mill. This tithe in sweat built Europe's infrastructure. The soaring Gothic cathedrals that still dominate skylines, funded not by treasure, but by millions of unpaid hours from believers who hauled stones or carved wood to erase their sins. A French monk's diary from 1342 describes how entire villages would arrive after harvest, turning monastery fields into bustling work sites, their toil a living currency exchanged for salvation. Land was the ultimate prize. As tithes swelled church holdings, it became Europe's largest landlord, controlling nearly 1/3 of all arable soil by the 13th century. Unlike kings who squandered estates on wars, the church held land in perpetuity, its estates passing undivided from generation to generation. Bishops administered these territories like corporate CEOs, leasing fields back to peasants for additional rent. The bishopric of Durham in England didn't just collect spiritual dues, it ran coal mines, fisheries, and even had its own parliament. This system had a dark edge, of course. When tithes were withheld, punishment was swift. Excommunication wasn't just a spiritual threat. It meant being cut off from communal grain stores or losing access to milling rights. In Normandy, records show peasants bribing priests with extra eggs or firewood to avoid being cursed with blighted crops. Yet for all its weight, the tithe economy also provided stability. During famines, monasteries often opened their storehouses, knowing starving tenants couldn't pay next year's dues. The church's wealth wasn't just hoarded, it was recycled into a safety net that secular rulers rarely matched. The legacy of this spiritual economy lingers in plain sight. Modern tax codes still use the term tithe for charitable deductions, the concept of contributing a portion of one's income, whether to churches, governments, or mutual aid networks, remains rooted in this medieval bargain between earthly survival and eternal promises. Gold might have built palaces, but it was barley, sweat, and faith that built civilization. A knight charging into battle wasn't just fighting for glory, he was fighting for furniture. That's right, the clattering of swords and the cries of war often boiled down to something as mundane as who got the defeated lord's tapestries or the contents of his grain stores. In the medieval military economy, salaries weren't handed out in neat little pouches of coins. Instead, payment came in the form of plunder, whatever you could grab from the enemy's lands, from bolts of Flemish cloth to herds of cattle. And the most coveted prize of all, land itself. A victorious commander might reward his men with parcels of conquered territory, turning bloodshed into real estate deals where the stakes were life and death. This system created a brutal but effective incentive structure. Soldiers knew their fortunes depended directly on their success in battle. The more territory they helped seize, the more they stood to gain. When William the Conqueror's Normans overran England in 1066, they didn't just claim the throne, they carved up the entire country like a pie, distributing manors and villages to loyal knights. The Domesday Book, that meticulous inventory of England's wealth, was essentially a receipt for this wholesale transfer of property. Overnight, landless warriors became landlords, their status secured not by gold but by the acres they now controlled. But plunder wasn't just about land. The spoils of war flowed downward through the ranks in a cascading system of rewards. A knight might claim a captured castle, while his squire took the dead opponent's armor. Foot soldiers divided up everything from livestock to kitchen utensils. Even the humblest camp follower might end up with a sack of grain or a stolen cloak. This wasn't random chaos, it was a formalized economy where every participant understood their share. Records from the 100 Years' War show soldiers meticulously inventorying loot, down to the last silver spoon, because these objects represented their pension, their future security. The genius and cruelty of this system was how it bound military might directly to territorial control. Kings didn't need vast treasuries to fund armies. They needed promises of fertile lands waiting to be taken. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, they weren't just vandalizing a city, they were liquidating assets, stripping palaces bare, and auctioning off entire neighborhoods to fund their campaign. The Venetian merchants who financed the crusade didn't want gold. They demanded strategic ports and trading quarters as repayment. Yet this plunder economy had a dark flip side. Without constant conquest, the system collapsed. Knights who ran out of new lands to seize turned on each other, sparking endless feuds. Mercenary companies, left unpaid after wars ended, became roaming bandits. The very violence that enriched soldiers also destabilized the societies they were supposed to protect. By the late Middle Ages, kings began shifting toward cash payments, not out of kindness, but because they realized standing armies required steady funding, not just the promise of loot. The echoes of this system still resonate today. Modern military contractors operate on a similar profit from conflict model, and the concept of spoils of war remains embedded in international law. Even the word soldier itself comes from the Latin solidus, a gold coin, a late medieval attempt to replace plunder with regular pay. But for centuries, the equation was simple: conquest equaled cash, and the true currency of war wasn't minted in silver. It was measured in trampled fields and emptied treasuries, in the very earth beneath the victor's boots. Imagine walking into a medieval marketplace where no coins changed hands. Instead, the air buzzed with the sound of haggling over sacks of grain, lengths of wool, and live chickens. This was the world of barter, a system so intuitive that even children understood its rules. A farmer with extra eggs didn't need silver pennies. He needed a new iron pot from the blacksmith. A weaver with bolts of cloth didn't dream of gold. She needed firewood to keep her family warm through winter. In this economy, value wasn't abstract, it was immediate, tangible, and deeply personal. Barter thrived because it solved two problems at once. It bypassed the scarcity of coins and matched surplus to need with precision. In rural villages, where money might appear only during tax season, barter was the lifeblood of daily survival. A miller took a portion of grain as payment for his work, then traded that grain for leather to repair his boots. The leather worker, in turn, might exchange the grain for a goose to fatten for the holidays. Each transaction created a ripple, binding the community in a web of mutual dependence. Records from English manors show that even rents were often paid in labor or goods, a day's work harvesting the Lord's fields, a dozen eggs, or a bundle of flax. But barter wasn't just practical, it was flexible in ways coinage could never be. A bad harvest might mean coins were useless, but a farmer could still negotiate with a baker. "I'll repair your fence now if you'll give my family bread come winter." These credit-based deals, sealed with a handshake, allowed communities to weather hard times without collapsing. In Scandinavia, fishermen and farmers operated a system called strandhog, where coastal dwellers traded dried fish for grain from inlanders, a survival pact etched in geography rather than ledgers. The system had its quirks, of course. Without standardized prices, every trade was a miniature drama of persuasion and compromise. A chronicle from 14th century Germany describes a heated debate over whether a fattened pig was worth 2 iron plowshares or 3. And some items became de facto measuring sticks. In Ireland, a cow's value was often expressed in units of butter, while in Russia, squirrel pelts served as small change substitutes. What's fascinating is how barter's legacy lingers. Modern farmers' markets where handmade cheese is swapped for honey echo medieval fairs. During economic crises, from the Great Depression to hyperinflation in Venezuela, communities instinctively revert to barter when money fails. Even the digital age hasn't erased this primal system. Online platforms now facilitate barter between businesses, trading warehouse space for legal services or graphic design for accounting. Gold might glitter in history books, but the true medieval marketplace ran on something far more resilient: trust, resourcefulness, and the unshakable understanding that real wealth isn't stored in vaults. It's woven into the fabric of what people can do, grow, and share. Fairs like those in Champagne weren't just markets, they were medieval Wall Streets, where fortunes were made with handshakes and tally sticks instead of stock tickers. Twice a year, merchants from Flanders to Florence converged on these sprawling tent cities, their wagons groaning with wool, wine, wax, and every imaginable commodity. But what's astonishing isn't just the volume of trade, it's how little actual money changed hands. In an era before widespread coinage, these fairs ran on something far more innovative: trust, credit, and the sheer gravitational pull of good merchandise. Take the Champagne Fair's most revolutionary tool, the lettre de foi, a primitive promissory note. A Flemish wool merchant might sell his entire season's haul to an Italian buyer, not for a chest of coins, but for a scrap of parchment promising payment at the next fair. These notes circulated like currency, endorsed and retraded among merchants with only the ink-stamped seal of a fair official as guarantee. It was capitalism in its rawest form, built not on precious metals but on the collective belief that a bolt of English broadcloth or a barrel of Gascon wine held undeniable, transferable worth. The real magic happened in the fair's final days, when all debts were settled in a flurry of ledger adjustments. Instead of hauling sacks of silver across Europe, merchants simply balanced what they owed against what they were owed. A German selling timber might cancel out his debt to a French spice importer with a few strokes of a scribe's quill. This multilateral clearing system, essentially a medieval version of electronic banking, allowed vast sums to change hands without a single coin being minted. But the true lifeblood of these fairs wasn't financial instruments, it was the goods themselves. A Genos trader might arrive with sacks of alum, a mineral crucial for fixing dyes in textiles. By week's end, he'd bartered it directly for Flemish cloth, then traded the cloth for Baltic furs, and finally exchanged the furs for spices bound for his home port. Each swap increased his profit margin without ever touching currency. The fairgrounds buzzed with this alchemy of transformation, where value wasn't stored in metal, but in the endless recombination of useful things. Seasonality gave these fairs their rhythm. The Champagne circuit dovetailed with agricultural cycles, spring fairs for wool sheared after winter, autumn fairs for grain harvests and wine pressings. Merchants timed their travels to hit multiple fairs like stations on a medieval trade railroad, their caravans becoming rolling warehouses. The system was so finely tuned that a bolt of cloth woven in Bruges in March could become a doublet in Milan by December, having passed through a dozen hands without anyone ever quoting its price in gold. What these fairs reveal is a commercial culture that thought in commodities first, coins second. When King Philip the Fair tried to impose royal coinage at the Champagne fairs in the 1300s, merchants revolted not because they hated money, but because their intricate web of credit and barter worked better than rigid currency ever could. The lesson, real economic vitality doesn't come from hoarded treasure, but from the constant flow of goods meeting needs. Gold may have glittered in royal treasuries, but the medieval economy ran on something far more powerful: the collective certainty that a bale of cotton was worth exactly as much as the bread, iron, or labor it could be traded for. The glitter of Islamic gold dinars and silver dirhams masked a deeper truth: these coins were just the grease that kept a far more fascinating economy turning. While Europe obsessed over precious metals, merchants from Cordoba to Samarkand were building fortunes with cargoes that would have baffled a medieval banker: sacks of peppercorns, bundles of Persian silk, and even crates of handwritten books. The real wealth of the Islamic trade empires wasn't in their minted coins. It was in their ability to move knowledge and luxury across continents, creating a marketplace where a rare manuscript could be worth more than its weight in gold. Consider the spice routes that stretched from the Moluccas to Morocco. Arab traders didn't just transport pepper and cinnamon, they transformed them into intellectual property. A 9th century merchant's ledger from Baghdad lists spices alongside medical texts because their value wasn't merely culinary. Physicians like Ibn Sina prescribed pepper for digestive ailments, while saffron featured in both gourmet dishes and eye treatments. These weren't commodities, they were cross-disciplinary technologies, traded with the same reverence others reserved for holy relics. A single ship carrying cloves from Zanzibar might also bear astronomical charts, its captain navigating by stars while his cargo doubled as pharmacy and pantry. Then there were textiles, the stealth currency of Islamic luxury. When the Umayyad caliphs wanted to impress foreign ambassadors, they didn't parade their gold reserves. They unfurled carpets so intricate they were said to mimic paradise. Persian silk brocades woven with gold thread weren't just clothing, they were wearable banknotes, compact enough to smuggle across borders yet universally recognized. A merchant in Damascus might settle a debt with a bolt of Egyptian linen, while a Moorish weaver in Andalusia could trade her finest shawl for a Greek translation of Aristotle. Textiles crossed the divide between art and asset, their value rising not from rarity alone, but from the skill encoded in every thread. But perhaps the most surprising Islamic currency was knowledge itself. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad didn't hoard gold, it collected papyrus scrolls and parchment codices, paying translators in silver dirhams to render Greek philosophy into Arabic. A well-copied medical treatise by Galen could fetch more than a chest of coins in Cordoba's book markets, where scholars and caliphs alike jostled for the latest geometric proofs or astronomical tables. When the famed traveler Ibn Battuta needed funds, he didn't pawn jewelry. He taught Islamic law, trading his expertise for food and lodging across 30 years of wanderings. This system thrived because Islamic trade networks treated value as fluid. A camel caravan might leave Basra carrying dates and return laden with Central Asian mercury for alchemy. Venetian glass could be exchanged for Tunisian olive oil in Alexandria, then traded again for Indian steel in Aden. The dinars that changed hands were mere placeholders in a grander equation, one where a merchant's real wealth lay in his ability to connect cinnamon groves to cathedral kitchens or translate Persian poetry into Sicilian court culture. The lesson written in these ancient ledgers: true currency isn't about the medium, it's about the meaning we assign it. While Europe locked its wealth in castle vaults, the Islamic world spun a web of connections where a book of algebra or a bundle of ginger could reshape civilizations. Gold may have built fortresses, but it was pepper, parchment, and patronage that built the modern world. The secret to Byzantine power wasn't just in their glittering mosaics or towering walls. It was in something far softer, far more delicate. Imagine a single thread, so fine it seemed spun by angels, unraveling across continents to bind empires together. This was Byzantine silk, a fabric so coveted that emperors treated its production like a state secret, locking it behind palace walls and punishing smugglers with execution. While other rulers flaunted gold, Byzantine diplomats carried bolts of silk as their ultimate bargaining chip, because in the Game of Thrones, nothing opened doors like the whisper of fabric that felt like liquid treasure. The monopoly began with a daring theft. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian sent 2 monks disguised as merchants to China, smuggling silkworm eggs hollowed out in their walking staffs. Overnight, Byzantium broke China's 1,000-year stranglehold on silk production. But the Byzantines didn't just replicate the process, they perfected it. Weaving threads dyed in Tyrian purple, a color so exclusive its use was punishable by death for commoners, and gold to create fabrics that shimmered like sunlight on water. A single robe could take a year to produce, its value exceeding entire estates. Silk became the ultimate soft power tool. When barbarian kings demanded tribute, Byzantine envoys offered silk instead of gold, knowing the psychological impact of draping a chieftain in fabric finer than anything his people could produce. A Frankish chronicle describes how receiving a silk cloak from Constantinople reduced a Germanic warlord to tears, so overwhelmed was he by its otherworldly beauty. The Vatican paid for alliances with Byzantine silk, using it to robe cardinals and line altars. Even Islamic caliphs, theoretically at war with Byzantium, secretly traded for it, their wives and daughters refusing to settle for lesser fabrics. The real genius lay in control. Unlike gold mines that could be captured, silk production was concentrated in a single guarded compound within Constantinople's Great Palace. Workers lived under armed watch, forbidden from leaving or marrying outsiders. The penalty for revealing production secrets, blinding a punishment reserved for only the gravest crimes against the state. This iron grip allowed emperors to manipulate markets at will. During negotiations with Venice, they might suddenly discover a warehouse of rare silks, flooding the market to crash prices and bankrupt rival merchants. Yet silk's power went deeper than economics. It was a psychological weapon. Byzantine emperors staged elaborate ceremonies where foreign envoys were made to wait in courtyards. their rough woolen cloaks contrasting painfully with the silk-draped courtiers. By the time negotiations began, the visitors were already psychologically disarmed, their sense of cultural inferiority carefully cultivated. A Persian ambassador once wrote home in despair after seeing Byzantine silk curtains billowing in the wind, lamenting that his empire could never match such refinement. The monopoly finally crumbled when Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, scattering silk workers to Italy. But for 6 centuries, Byzantium proved that true currency isn't just about weight or shine, it's about controlling desire itself. Gold could buy armies, but silk bought something far more valuable: the illusion that some civilizations were touched by divinity, their very fabric too exquisite for mortal hands. A Viking warrior didn't stash his wealth in a locked chest, he wore it on his arm. Those iconic silver arm rings found in Scandinavian hoards weren't just jewelry, they were a brilliant financial innovation forged by necessity. In the frozen fjords and storm-tossed trading posts of the Viking world, survival demanded currencies as flexible as the people who carried them. Unlike rigid coinage that could vanish in a shipwreck or be stolen by raiders, these rings combined personal adornment with pragmatic utility. Need to pay for a new axe, twist off a segment, time to settle a blood debt, weigh out the exact amount on portable scales. This was money that doubled as armor for the wearer's economic survival. What made these rings revolutionary was their inherent adaptability. Crafted from twisted or braided silver wires, they could be snipped into precise weights using shears, a far cry from the fixed denominations of imperial coinage. A trader in Dublin's bustling markets might accept a nub of ring silver for a wool cloak, while a chieftain in Norway could amass whole coils as a display of power. Archaeological finds reveal rings chopped into fragments as small as a fingernail, proving they functioned like human ATMs, wearable, divisible, and always accessible. Even the broken pieces had value. Hoards often contain hack silver, irregular chunks that circulated like medieval loose change. The system reflected Viking society's brutal pragmatism. Silver's worth wasn't in its face value but in its purity, tested by nicks and bites to confirm it wasn't lead-coated in silver wash. A saga describes a merchant suspiciously eyeing a payment until he bit the metal and tasted real silver beneath. Rings also served as emergency reserves. When raids went wrong or harvests failed, a warrior could literally cash in his armware to buy food or freedom. Some rings even bear runic inscriptions naming their owners, turning personal wealth into a form of identity, like a passport and bank card fused into one. But perhaps the ring's greatest legacy was their role in knitting together a vast trade network. From the Volga to Greenland, Vikings used this standardized silver weight system to bridge linguistic and cultural gaps. A Swedish trader in Constantinople could convert his rings into Byzantine coins, while a Danish settler in England might pay for land with the same silver that once adorned his ancestors. The system was so effective that it outlasted the Viking Age. Medieval Irish merchants still valued goods in ounces of silver centuries later. Modern parallels abound. Today's digital wallets and contactless payments echo the Vikings' preference for portable, divisible wealth. Cryptocurrency enthusiasts might recognize the spirit of decentralized value in these ancient ring economies. But the real lesson lies deeper. The Vikings understood that true currency isn't about abstract numbers on a ledger. It's about creating systems that bend to human need, whether that means hacking silver from an armband or tapping a phone to pay. Their rings didn't just hold value, they embodied the resilience of an entire way of life, where wealth wasn't locked away but carried proudly into battle, ready to be transformed at a moment's notice. A king's face stamped on a coin was supposed to be a promise, a guarantee that the silver or gold in your palm held real, measurable worth. But medieval rulers quickly realized something sinister. By secretly shaving off precious metal and mixing in cheaper metals like copper or lead, they could stretch their treasuries further. This practice, called debasement, turned coins into hollow symbols of value, their metallic guts slowly replaced with fool's gold. And with each round of debasement, something else eroded: trust. A peasant holding a freshly minted penny might notice it felt lighter, rang duller, or showed copper streaks when scratched. Suddenly, the entire economy trembled on a knife's edge. The consequences were immediate and chaotic. In 1254, Henry III of England was caught red-handed ordering his mints to produce pennies with 30% less silver. Prices skyrocketed as merchants, fearing their coins would soon be worthless, demanded more of them for the same goods. Records from London's markets show bread prices doubling in weeks, not because grain was scarcer, but because the money itself had grown suspect. In Florence, bankers began weighing coins rather than counting them, treating royal currency like raw bullion, the very foundation of trade. The belief that a coin's stamped value matched its real worth was crumbling. This breakdown sent people scrambling for alternatives. In France, tax collectors started refusing royal coins altogether, insisting payment in kind: bushels of wheat, barrels of wine, or days of labor. Towns along the Rhine revived ancient barter systems, with toll bridges accepting livestock instead of suspect pennies. But the real winners were the timeless commodities that had always held intrinsic value. Salt, immune to royal tampering, became a de facto currency in markets from Burgundy to Bavaria. A chronicle from 14th century Poland describes farmers trading salt blocks like coins, each chunk broken along pre-scored lines to ensure consistent weight. Wool, too, surged as a reliable medium, its value tied not to a king's whims but to the immutable laws of supply and demand. The psychological impact ran deep. When people lose faith in official money, they don't just switch currencies, they rethink the nature of value itself. In England, villagers began hiding pre-debasement coins under floorboards, creating accidental time capsules that archaeologists now call coin hoards. Italian merchants developed an early form of currency hedging, holding wealth in Venetian glass or Persian carpets rather than volatile coinage. Even the language shifted. The word sterling, originally meaning of fixed weight, became a synonym for reliability, a quiet rebellion against debased money. What's striking is how these medieval crises mirror modern ones. When Zimbabwe's hyperinflation rendered cash worthless in the 2000s, people turned to goat herds and canned food. In Venezuela, cigarettes and USB drives became informal currencies. The pattern is universal. When trust in money fails, societies revert to what's tangible, useful, and beyond government manipulation. Medieval kings learned too late that you can't decree value into existence, not when a farmer would rather clutch a sack of salt than a fistful of fading promises. Debasement didn't just weaken coins, it exposed the fragile illusion that value comes from authority rather than collective belief. And once that illusion shattered, even a king's face on a coin couldn't glue it back together. When the tax collector came knocking in medieval Europe, he rarely asked for coins. He wanted your chickens, your wheat, or the sweat of your brow. This was taxation in kind, a system where governments demanded the very substances of life rather than abstract currency. Picture a peasant standing in his field, watching as royal officials counted out sacks of his hard-won barley, not to sell for gold, but to pour directly into the king's granaries. These weren't just levies, they were society's way of acknowledging a fundamental truth. Real power came from controlling tangible resources, not shiny metal. Take the English Domesday Book of 1086. that great inventory of William the Conqueror's new kingdom. Its pages don't obsess over coin hoards, they meticulously record how many plow teams each village could muster, how many pigs grazed in its woods, how many eels swam in its streams. Why? Because those were the units of taxation. A farmer might owe the crown 10 bushels of rye, 20 days' labor repairing roads, or 5 fattened geese for the royal larder. The system was brutally practical. Coins could vanish or depreciate, but a harvest carted straight to the castle gates kept armies fed and bureaucrats paid. Labor taxes revealed even deeper cleverness. Instead of draining peasants' meager coin purses, lords required them to work certain days on Domesday lands, the lord's personal fields. This corvée system built castles, cleared forests, and maintained bridges without a single penny changing hands. In France, peasants owed the infamous banalité obligations, grinding grain at the lord's mill, baking in his oven, pressing grapes in his winepress, all for hefty fees paid in produce. The genius was inescapable. By tying taxes to essential infrastructure, rulers ensured their upkeep while simultaneously profiting from them. But the real shock comes when we see how far this system stretched. When the Mongols conquered Russia, they imposed a tax called the yasak, payable in squirrel pelts. Not because they had a bizarre fur fetish, but because these pelts functioned as currency across their empire. In Egypt, the Mamluks collected taxes in grain shipped directly to Cairo's vast warehouses, creating stockpiles that could feed cities during famines or supply armies on campaign. Even the Catholic Church got in on the act. Tithes weren't cash donations but literal tenths of crops, lambs, and eggs delivered to parish priests. The implications were profound. Taxing actual goods created self-correcting economies. A bad harvest meant lower grain taxes, preventing overburdening struggling farmers. Livestock taxes encouraged breeding programs to ensure herds grew. Unlike arbitrary coin demands that could ruin families, in-kind taxes adjusted naturally to local conditions. Of course, abuse still happened. Greedy bailiffs might demand the plumpest chickens or heaviest grain sacks, but the system inherently linked taxation to real productivity. Modern echoes of this approach linger in surprising places. Property taxes mirror medieval land-based levies, while jury duty and mandatory military service descend from labor obligations. Even income tax withholding channels the medieval instinct to collect resources directly at the source. The difference: today's governments convert everything to cash first. But when crises hit hyperinflation, bank failures, societies instinctively revert to medieval logic. During the Great Depression, rural Americans often paid doctors with chickens or produce, just as their ancestors might have done. What medieval taxation understood, and what we often forget, is that money is just a representation. The true foundation of any society lies in the food that feeds its people, the hands that build its infrastructure, the raw materials that fuel its growth. Gold makes for impressive crown jewels, but grain fills stomachs, wool clothes bodies, and labor raises cities. By collecting taxes in kind, medieval rulers weren't being primitive. They were cutting through the illusion to grasp the real levers of power. When the king's army marched on full stomachs and the royal workshops hummed with skilled labor, no one questioned where the treasury's coins had gone. The wealth was already at work, baked into the very bones of the kingdom. The scent of hops and yeast wafting through a monastery's cloisters wasn't just the promise of evening ale, it was the smell of economic ingenuity at work. Behind those austere walls, monks weren't just praying. They were running some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated breweries and bakeries, turning flour and fermentation into a financial lifeline. A single Benedictine abbey might produce hundreds of barrels of beer annually, not for rowdy taverns, but as a form of liquid currency that fed entire communities. In a world where bread was survival and beer was safer to drink than water, monasteries didn't just provide spiritual nourishment, they bankrolled local economies with every loaf and keg. Consider the math of a typical monastic operation. A large abbey like St. Gall in Switzerland employed dozens of lay brothers and peasants to till its fields, harvest barley, and grind grain. The bread baked in its ovens wasn't just for monks, it was distributed as wages to workers, traded for repairs to the chapel roof, or given as alms to the poor in exchange for prayers. Beer followed the same path. Records from 12th century Germany show monasteries accepting tithes in grain, then converting it into ale that could be bartered for everything from iron tools to woolen habits. A single ton of monastery brewed beer might cover a year's rent for a tenant farmer, while specially spiced batches reserved for feast days functioned like medieval gift cards redeemable for favors from local nobility. The system worked because these staples carried intrinsic value no gold coin could match. A peasant might never handle silver, but he understood exactly what a loaf made from abbey wheat was worth, especially during famines when monastery stores became emergency larders. In England, the Bishop of Winchester's estates maintained vast bakeries that supplied not just his household, but nearby markets, using bread as a stabilizing force in volatile economies. When harvests failed, these ovens kept baking, with loaves becoming a form of disaster relief that doubled as political capital. A lord who could keep bread on the table during lean years earned loyalty no army could crush. But monastic brewing was where the real alchemy happened. Beer's low alcohol content made it a dietary staple. Children drank small beer with meals, and laborers relied on its calories. By controlling production, monasteries effectively minted a consumable currency. The Trappists of Belgium famously traded strong ale for stained glass windows, while Czech monks used their famed pilsners to pay stonemasons expanding their churches. Some abbeys even issued beer tokens, lead or wooden tallies that could be exchanged for set quantities, creating a proto-monetary system. The irony was delicious. Men who'd taken vows of poverty became masters of a market where holiness was measured in malt and fermentation. This edible economy left fingerprints everywhere. Modern words like bridal from bride ale, a wedding feast funded by beer sales, and lord from H. Lofford, or loaf keeper whisper of this time when sustenance equaled power. Even today, Belgian Trappist breweries continue the tradition, their beers prized not just for flavor but for their sacred heritage. The medieval monks understood something we often forget. Real wealth isn't about accumulation, but circulation, taking the fruits of the earth and transforming them into something that nourishes, connects, and endures. Gold gathers dust, but bread shared is power multiplied. A dusty road stretching to the horizon, lined with weary travelers clutching wooden staffs and leather satchels. This was the pilgrimage route, the medieval equivalent of an economic superhighway. But these pilgrims weren't just carrying prayers, they were walking banks, their pouches stuffed with relics, indulgences, and votive offerings that functioned as spiritual currency. A fragment of a saint's bone wasn't just a holy object, it was a tradable asset capable of securing lodging, healing the sick, or even pardoning sins. The cathedral at Santiago de Compostela didn't just attract the faithful. It minted wealth through the sheer gravitational pull of its sacred relics, transforming faith into a thriving marketplace where blessings had price tags. Consider the economics of a typical pilgrim's journey. A French farmer setting out for Rome might pay his way by bartering sacks of wool to innkeepers along the route. In return, he'd receive not coins, but stamped lead badges from shrines, proof of his travels that could later be traded for favors back home. Meanwhile, monasteries along the route like Cluny or Monte Cassino operated like spiritual service stations, offering beds and meals in exchange for labor or precious relics donated by earlier pilgrims. A chronicle from Canterbury describes pilgrims leaving strips of their clothing as payment, believing the fabric absorbed healing powers from saintly tombs, making it valuable both spiritually and materially. The relic trade itself was a shadow economy of astonishing scale. When Constantinople fell to Crusaders in 1204, the city wasn't just looted for gold, its churches were stripped bare of holy remains. A single tooth of John the Baptist could ransom a nobleman, while a vial of Virgin Mary's milk might purchase a merchant's entire stock of silks. Venetian merchants grew fat shipping stolen relics back to Europe, where bishops competed to outbid each other for these divine status symbols. The Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris became one of the richest institutions in Christendom, not through tithes, but by strategically displaying the crown of thorns, a relic so potent it drew offerings from kings and paupers alike. But the real genius of pilgrimage economics lay in its infrastructure. Enterprising locals built bridges and charged tolls, while guides sold their services in exchange for a share of the pilgrims' eventual spiritual rewards. In the Alps, entire villages specialized in mountain rescue, pulling travelers from avalanches in exchange for promises of prayers, a celestial insurance policy. Even the humble scallop shell, symbol of the Camino de Santiago, became a form of currency. Pilgrims sewed them onto their cloaks as proof of completion, which could later be used to secure alms or preferential treatment. This system created bizarre contradictions. The same roads that carried devout pilgrims also hosted pickpockets selling fake relics and tavern keepers watering down ale for desperate travelers. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales captures the irony: worldly merchants and corrupt clergy rubbing shoulders with genuine seekers, all contributing to an economy where salvation and silver changed hands in equal measure. The Vatican eventually standardized the trade with official indulgences, turning forgiveness into a quantifiable commodity that could be bought, sold, or even inherited. What made pilgrimage currency so resilient was its dual nature. Unlike gold, which was just metal, a relic's value existed in the minds of believers, making it immune to debasement or inflation. A splinter of the true cross might be worthless to an unbeliever, but to a medieval Christian, it was a tangible connection to the divine that could heal sickness, avert disasters, or shorten a soul's time in purgatory. In an uncertain world, that kind of security was worth more than minted coin. The echoes of this system still surround us. Modern souvenir shops selling religious medals near shrines continue the relic trade tradition, while pilgrimage sites like Lourdes or Mecca generate billions in tourism revenue. Even our concept of bucket list travels descends from the medieval belief that some journeys transform not just your passport stamps, but your very soul. The roads may be paved now, and the payments digital, but the human desire to trade worldly resources for spiritual meaning remains as old as the dusty sandals of those first determined pilgrims. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it turned the medieval economy inside out. Imagine a world where the same fields that once teemed with laborers now lay empty, their owners desperate for anyone strong enough to swing a scythe. In this twisted new reality, a peasant who'd spent his life bent double under the Lord's whip suddenly found himself in the driver's seat. With half the workforce wiped out by plague, survival skills became the ultimate currency, and those who remained alive could name their price. A day's wages that once bought a loaf of bread could now demand a week's worth of food plus a plot of land. paid not in unreliable coins, but in the tangible stuff of life itself. In England, harvest records tell the shocking story. Before the plague, a thatcher might earn 2 pence a day. By 1351, that same craftsman could command 6 pence, triple the pay plus meals, lodging, and even a portion of the harvest. But the real revolution came in the form of land leases. Lords who'd lost entire families of tenants began offering fields rent-free for years just to keep them productive. In Norfolk, a shepherd named John Kemp famously negotiated not just higher wages, but the right to graze his own sheep on the Lord's pastures, a privilege unimaginable before the pestilence. Suddenly, the feudal pyramid was flipping, with laborers at the top dictating terms to the aristocracy. The shift wasn't just economic, it was existential. With death lurking around every corner, people stopped caring about gold's false promise. What good was a coin when there was no bread to buy with it? Contemporary accounts describe markets where craftsmen traded directly for food, bypassing money altogether. A carpenter might rebuild a baker's oven in exchange for a year's supply of loaves, while a midwife's services could be bartered for a milk cow and winter fodder. In Italy, the Datini archives show wool merchants paying workers in grain and olive oil, creating a hybrid system where survival goods became legal tender. Governments panicked at this upheaval. England's infamous Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to cap wages at pre-plague levels, threatening imprisonment for those who demanded more. But the laws were laughably unenforceable when your choice is between starving or paying a ploughman his price. Feudal principles quickly crumble. In Florence, the Ciompi wool workers revolted, not for political freedom, but for the right to be paid in reliable foodstuffs rather than fluctuating coinage. Their victory created Europe's first labor unions, built on the radical idea that a worker's worth should be measured in full bellies, not empty prestige. The most profound changes happened in the countryside. With so many dead, vast tracts of marginal land reverted to wilderness as survivors consolidated on the most fertile plots. In parts of France, peasants began practicing convertible husbandry, rotating crops with pasture in ways that required fewer hands but yielded more food per acre. This agricultural revolution, born from necessity, accidentally created surpluses that would later fuel urban growth. The plague hadn't just changed who held power, it had rewritten the rules of what power looked like. No longer was wealth about controlling people through feudal bonds. It was about attracting their labor through real incentives. By the time the plague's grip loosened, medieval Europe had glimpsed a startling truth. Gold's value was just a collective fiction, but a strong back and skilled hands. Those were currencies no pandemic could devalue. The Black Death's greatest legacy wasn't the corpses it left behind, but the living proof it provided, that when survival hangs in the balance, humans will always return to trading what truly matters. Not shiny abstractions, but the solid weight of grain in the sack, the warmth of wool on the back, and the security of land beneath one's feet. Gold crept back into power not with a fanfare, but with a whisper, slowly, reluctantly, as the medieval world stretched its cramped economic muscles and found local markets no longer sufficed. Picture a Genos merchant in 1500, staring at a ledger filled with transactions spanning Lisbon to Constantinople. Calculating the value of a shipment of Flemish wool in bushels of grain or lengths of cloth had become absurd when dealing across such distances. The very strengths that made grain and salt-perfect local currencies their bulk, their perishability, made them laughably impractical for global trade. A ship's hold that could carry a fortune in pepper would barely hold enough wheat to cover the crew's wages. Yet this shift wasn't sudden. For centuries, gold and silver had lurked in the background like understudies waiting for their cue. Italian bankers kept dual ledgers, one for local deals settled in goods, another for international trades requiring florins or ducats. In Bruges, the world's first stock exchange saw spices and silver change hands side by side, with brokers mentally converting cloves into grams of precious metal as effortlessly as we toggle between currencies on a travel app. The real turning point came when three forces collided: the explosion of long-distance trade, the rise of centralized states hungry for taxable wealth, and a technological revolution in mining that flooded Europe with newfound silver from Bohemia and gold from West Africa. Even then, old habits died hard. When the Spanish Empire started hauling unprecedented amounts of New World silver into Seville in the 1500s, they faced an unexpected problem. Farmers still preferred being paid in chickens. Inflation skyrocketed not just because there was more metal circulating, but because people didn't trust its sudden abundance. A German woodcut from 1521 shows peasants burying coins in their fields like acorns, hoping they'd sprout into reliable crops. The medieval instinct that real value lay in usable goods persisted even as coins jingled in every pocket. The true death knell for medieval currencies came from an unlikely source: double-entry bookkeeping. This Venetian innovation allowed merchants to track abstract debts across time and space, making it possible to conduct business without physically moving barrels of salt or herds of cattle. Once wealth could be recorded as numbers on a page rather than tangible objects, gold's portability and durability made it the logical backbone of the system. Yet the transition took centuries. As late as 1650, English landlords were still accepting rent payments in pepper, and French peasants resisted taxes in coin until forced by royal decree. What's fascinating is how fragments of the medieval system linger in our financial DNA. Stock market terms like commodities and futures descend directly from the pepper sacks and grain stores of medieval fairs. The word salary still carries the ghost of Roman salt rations, while fee originates from the Old English fee, meaning livestock. Even today, when crises strike, we instinctively revert to medieval logic. During hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, farmers traded eggs for shoes, and in post-war Japan, cigarettes became urban currency. Gold may have won the battle for dominance, but the medieval understanding that true worth lies in what sustains life never really disappeared. It just learned to wear a golden mask. Cryptocurrency enthusiasts might be surprised to learn they're channeling medieval merchants not in their tech, but in their radical rethinking of what makes something valuable. Just as a 12th century trader trusted the weight of a silver arm ring more than a king's debased coin, today's crypto adopters prefer algorithms over central banks. The parallels run deeper than either group realizes. Medieval economies thrived on decentralized systems where value emerged from collective need rather than royal decree, exactly the philosophy underpinning blockchain networks. When Venetian merchants traded pepper-backed letters of credit across continents, they were essentially using a primitive version of smart contracts, agreements enforced by reputation and necessity, not legal systems. Consider how medieval communities created stability without centralized control. The Hanseatic League's trade empire operated like a decentralized autonomous organization, DAO, with member cities enforcing rules through mutual interest rather than a central authority. Disputes were settled via merchant tribunals, not royal courts, a system startlingly similar to crypto's preference for decentralized arbitration. Even the Vikings' hackable silver rings find their echo in Bitcoin's divisible units, both designed for adaptability in unpredictable environments. These weren't primitive workarounds, they were sophisticated solutions to the same problems modern cryptocurrencies aim to solve. how to establish trust without relying on fallible institutions. The most profound lesson lies in how societies assign worth. Medieval peasants never questioned the value of a bushel of grain. It fed families. Similarly, crypto's true believers don't base their faith on government backing, but on a technology's utility. Ethereum's ether isn't valuable because it's official. It's valuable because it powers contracts and applications. This mirrors how Byzantine silk derived worth from irreplicable craftsmanship, not imperial stamps. Both systems expose the illusion that value comes from authority rather than collective belief in usefulness. Yet history also offers warnings. Just as medieval debasement eroded trust in coinage, cryptocurrency scams and volatile swings risk undermining the very decentralization they champion. The 14th century collapse of the Champagne fares, once a thriving decentralized trade network, came when kings imposed rigid monetary controls. Modern regulators now face the same dilemma: how to prevent fraud without stifling innovation. Even the environmental critique of crypto mining parallels medieval debates. The salt mines of Salzburg drained forests for fuel, forcing societies to weigh progress against sustainability. Perhaps the ultimate insight is this: humans keep rediscovering that real value isn't about the medium, but what it enables. Gold's victory as currency wasn't inevitable. It was a contingent response to expanding trade networks, much like crypto's rise amid digital globalization. The medieval world reminds us that when systems grow too rigid, people invent alternatives. Whether those alternatives last depends not on their novelty, but on their ability to meet fundamental human needs for trust, for utility, for resilience. The next time you hear Bitcoin compared to digital gold, remember, the most transformative currencies in history were never just stores of value. They were tools for living. The medieval world understood something we've forgotten. Real wealth isn't about what glitters, it's about what sustains. For centuries, kingdoms rose and fell not on the strength of their gold reserves, but on their ability to secure the humble currencies of survival. Salt preserved empires, grain fed revolutions, land anchored power. Labor built cathedrals from the ground up. These weren't just commodities. They were the lifeblood of an entire economic system that measured value in full bellies, warm cloaks, and planted fields. Take a moment to imagine the sheer practicality of it all. A lord collecting taxes in sacks of wheat knew exactly what he was getting, something that couldn't vanish overnight through inflation or bank runs. A merchant trading pepper as collateral wasn't speculating on abstract markets. He was dealing in a substance so universally needed that its worth transcended borders and languages. Even the Vikings, with their wearable silver rings, crafted a system where money could be hacked apart and reassembled to meet the needs of the moment. This wasn't primitive economics, it was resilience engineering. What's most striking is how these medieval priorities flip modern assumptions upside down. Today, we chase digital numbers on screens, stocks that exist as fleeting concepts, cryptocurrencies untethered from anything tangible. Yet when crises hit, war, pandemics, climate disasters, we instinctively revert to the medieval playbook. Suddenly, canned food, clean water, and generators become the real currencies. The lesson: gold might dominate in times of peace, but utility always wins when survival is on the line. This history also exposes the fragility of our financial myths. We're taught that money's value is intrinsic, but medieval economies prove it's just a shared story. A gold coin only works because everyone agrees it does, just like a Bitcoin or a dollar bill. But salt, grain, those didn't need consensus. Their worth was written in the unshakable logic of human need. A starving army won't fight for treasure chests, but it will march for bread. So the next time you hear someone equate wealth with digits in a bank account, Remember the medieval spice trader who could feed a village with a single sack of peppercorns, or the serf whose labor built a castle stone by stone. True value isn't about scarcity or shine. It's about connection to the things that keep us alive, thriving, and human. Maybe that's the most enduring legacy of the medieval world. A reminder that economies work best when they're rooted not in abstraction, but in the dirt, the sweat, and the salt of real life. If this journey through hidden currencies reshaped how you see value, hit that like button and subscribe to keep uncovering the stories that challenge what we think we know. History isn't just about the past, it's a mirror showing us who we really are. And sometimes the reflection is more surprising than we expect.